I'm by no means the critic who's most down on this film. Many people have enjoyed this less than I have. But I think one thing that is really lacking is this idea that, okay, you have Emily Blunt on set and you have Charlize Theron on set, and they're wearing these ridiculous gowns and silver and gold eyeshadow, and they've got magic spells, and they're going to just have this kind of big showdown together. And it should be fun. You should be really geared up for it. There should be something almost camp about it, I think. And, if you look at what actresses like Eva Green did in the 300 sequel, which I want to call 300 Birth of a Nation. I know that's not the title of it. In a way, it kind of... what was it? Rise of an Empire, right? In a way, that kind of works as well. But 300 Rise of an Empire... And even Michelle Pfeiffer in playing Catwoman in Batman Returns, there's this idea that if you're going to play wicked, you have to have a little bit of fun with it. And this has actually been a sticking point, not just for me in Huntsman Winter's War, but in all of these fairy tale movies that, of course, were commissioned in a big rush after Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland hit so big in 2010. Studios suddenly realised, oh my goodness, we can actually make a film the core demographic of which is not teenage boys, and it can still make an absolute fortune. So let's scour around for other possible sources of income and revenue. And one that they settled on was fairy tale films. And it was made at a time when Twilight was coming up. E1, the distributor, was kind of based their entire business off the success of Twilight, which is terrific. And so this idea that blockbusters were going to be made for a new audience, in theory, was very appealing. In practice, it didn't really pay off because... in Snow White and the Huntsman, you had Kristen Stewart was cast as Snow White. She was basically just transplanted from Twilight into that film to be moody and sullen and bring across all those kind of Twilighty qualities to the movie. You had this Game of Thrones aesthetic that didn't quite match up with the story particularly well. And also these weird borrowings from anime movies that I'm sure the target audience for the original Snow White and the Huntsman film were into, but you had kind of magical stags cantering in from like Miyazaki films and things. And it just didn't really gel. And in practice, it was a really kind of miserable slog, and it shouldn't have been. This new film picks up now. It's 4 years after, in real world terms, 7 years after, I stand corrected, in Snow White and the Huntsman terms. And Kristen Stewart's character, Snow White herself, is basically sidelined. You have Chris Hemsworth as the Huntsman, who's trying to keep the magic mirror out of Queen Freya's clutches because she wants to use it to summon back Queen Ravenna, who's Charlize Theron's character. And at the start, you have as we talked a little bit, you have this prologue, which is very, very, very familiar, basically smacks completely of Frozen. You have two royal sisters, one suffers heartbreak, develops ice magic, flees the mountains, lives in a giant icicle, wears turquoise. You can't even say, oh, well, we're just borrowing this from the Snow Queen, it's Hans Christian Andersen, because no, Frozen really heavily adapted the Snow Queen. And it's ended up at exactly the same point as the Huntsman Winter's War has done. But thankfully, this story then gets sidelined to Chris Hemsworth's antics in the forest with his dwarf companions, who are played by Nick Frost and Rob Brydon, and also a huntswoman. As Emily Blunt explained, there is a whole society of huntspeople. Chris Hemsworth is a huntsman. And Jessica Chastain is playing a huntswoman who's called Sarah and who was betrothed to him a long time ago, who re-emerges from the forest to help him. Now, Jessica Chastain is exactly the kind of person, again, in theory, that you want in a film like this. She's, Crimson Peak, A Most Violent Year, Take Shelter, Tree of Life. Almost nothing is beyond her. However, in Winter's War, we discover the one thing that is, and that is a Scottish accent. Now, for some reason, the huntsman in the first film was Scottish. Chris Hemsworth just kind of brazened it out. It was a little bit Shrekky, but it worked. And Jessica Chastain tries to do the same. And I mean, this accent is so bad, it's kind of accidentally racist. It goes that far. And, if you can deal with it, it's not, this is not a kind of a particularly highbrow drama where all that kind of verisimilitude is totally key to the film working. But, it's like if you think of The Princess Bride, the accents in that film were not particularly great, but it doesn't really matter. So you can kind of excuse it and you can kind of accept it's just part of the fun and part of the context of this big fantasy world. And I think, shaky as the storytelling is, and it does kind of shake around all over the place, the actual world of the film is very appealing. It's not this tonal mishmash that the first film was. They go much more directly down a straightforward, this is a kind of a Dungeons and Dragons style world, big mossy glades, forests, a lot of rain, the dwarves kind of lumbering around with all this fantastic equipment. And there are some lovely little visual flourishes, like there's a snake with moss growing on its back, which is just a lovely idea that I don't think I've seen anywhere before. And the goblins in the film, which make an appearance halfway through, they steal the mirror and it has to be retrieved from them, are kind of like slightly reminded me of the winged monkeys from The Wizard of Oz, in that they're these large, kind of bulky chimpanzee-like characters that lurk in the trees with these huge horns on their heads. And it just, these little kind of visual flourishes does help to kind of pick up the energy a bit and give you a reason to enjoy being in the world of the film, even if the story being told is not that compelling. It's interesting, the director of the movie is a guy called Nicolas-Troyan, who was the special effects supervisor on the first film. This is his first film as director. And it makes total sense that what works about this movie is the richness of the environment. I think the 3D as well is actually surprisingly well used. It gives this kind of all-enveloping quality to the world, and it's really sharply achieved. So I liked all that. Another standout person is Sheridan Smith, who turns up as a dwarf maiden halfway through the film, with a talent for foul language that can only really be described as musical. I mean, I can't even quote any of the stuff she says here, but these incredibly florid and flamboyant swearing marathons that she goes on. So if you take it for what it is, I actually quite enjoyed this. I thought it was lighter and funnier and nimbler than the first film. And even if the story is a bit shambolic, it still kind of struck a chord with me just on terms of enjoy, veg out, and, savour being in this fantasy world.